Let me tell you something that the Western media does not want you to understand. A few days ago, the United States of America, the self-proclaimed guardian of free navigation, the country that lectures the entire world about open seas and international law, tried to block the Strait of Hormuz. And it failed. It failed completely. And not only did it fail, it was humiliated. A Chinese tanker, sanctioned by Washington, carrying methanol from the UAE, sailed right through that so-called blockade and exited the Persian Gulf without a single scratch. You can go to Marina Traffic. Come right now and track it yourself. The ship is called the Rich Starry, and it moved through waters that Donald Trump said were under American control. This is not a small thing. This is not a footnote. This is a signal to the entire world about where American power actually stands today. Now, I want to take you back to what happened just before this moment because context matters enormously, and the Western media deliberately strips that context away so that you can never understand what is actually happening. In the days leading up to this humiliation, there were negotiations in Islamabad. Iran sent a delegation. The Speaker of Parliament led it. He had full authority. He had spoken directly with Ayatollah Khamenei before departing. Iran went to those talks not with great hope, but with a clear purpose. The Iranian people needed to see that their government had tried every possible path before the situation escalated further. And the people of the world needed to see the same thing. Because when war comes, and enemies begin to say you could have avoided this, that argument, even when it is dishonest, can have an effect. Iran understood that, and so they went. Now, J.D. Vance was there representing the American side. And what was he doing during those negotiations? He was making phone calls, constant phone calls. The Iranian delegation, by contrast, made none. They had their authority. They came prepared. Vance was calling Tel Aviv. He was calling Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu himself later confirmed this publicly. He said that Vance was reporting to him. The Vice President of the United States of America was reporting to the Prime Minister of a small colonial entity that depends entirely on American money and American weapons for its survival. And Netanyahu said this openly. He was proud of it. And I think every single American who heard those words should have felt something deeply wrong in their chest. Because what it means is that the foreign policy of the United States, decisions that affect the price of gasoline, the price of food, the lives of American soldiers, the economic future of American families, these decisions are not being made in Washington. They are being made in Tel Aviv by a man who has no accountability to the American people whatsoever. Joe Kent understood this. When he resigned, he said it clearly in his letter. This war was not started because of any Iranian nuclear threat. It was not started because Iran was about to build a weapon. That was a lie, and everyone in the intelligence community knows it. Joe Kent said the war was started because of the Israeli lobby. Because Netanyahu wanted it. Because the forces that control Washington through money and through what the Epstein files have begun to reveal, those forces demanded it. And Trump, who is many things but is not independent, complied. So the attack came. And the negotiations in Islamabad were happening while Iran already knew the attack was coming. Iran was not surprised. It did not know the exact day or the exact hour, but it knew. And it prepared. Let me explain something about the Strait of Hormuz that the American media will never explain to its audience properly. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow body of water. 20%. Every single day, tankers carrying the energy that runs factories in South Korea, lights up cities in Japan, fuels industries across Europe and India, those tankers move through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no realistic alternative. Building the infrastructure to replace what flows through that strait would require trillions of dollars of investment and many, many years. The United States cannot replace it. American oil is more expensive to produce and more expensive to ship. American LNG cannot fill the gap. American fertilizer exports, American petrochemical products, none of it can compensate for what flows through that waterway every single day. So when Trump announced a blockade, who was he actually hurting? He was hurting South Korea. He was hurting Japan. He was hurting Australia. He was hurting India, which had been so supportive of Netanyahu throughout this entire catastrophe. Modi had quietly backed the Israeli regime through 2.5 years of slaughter in Gaza and now into Lebanon. And what does Netanyahu give India in return? He wrecks the Indian economy by pushing for a blockade that cuts off their energy supply. Netanyahu does not care about India. He does not care about South Korea or Japan or the European countries that have supported Israel for decades. He does not care about them. They are useful instruments, and when they stop being useful or when their interests get in the way, they simply do not matter. And the Arab family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, let us be honest about their situation. They are far more vulnerable to this blockade than Iran is. They have oil and gas. That is essentially what they have. They do not have agriculture to sustain their populations. They do not have the diverse industrial base that Iran has built over decades of sanctions. Iran borders Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan. Across the Caspian it reaches Kazakhstan and Russia. Then there is Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, Iraq. Iran can trade in every direction. And during the past several months, as American forces were building up in the region and threatening war, the price of energy went up significantly. Iran sold oil. Iran had approximately 200 million barrels sitting on ships at sea. It sold roughly half of that at very high prices. It still has around 100 million barrels available. So the sanctions and the blockade that were supposed to cripple Iran have not crippled Iran. They have in many ways strengthened Iran's financial position in this moment. Now let us talk about China, because this is where things become genuinely important for understanding the future. A Chinese tanker sailed through the American blockade, just sailed right through. The Chinese government had already said clearly that they would not be blocked, that they would continue trading with Iran, that the Americans had no legal or moral authority to impose such restrictions on international waterways. And they meant it. This was not just words. This was a Chinese ship moving through the strait, and the Americans could not or would not stop it, because stopping it would mean confronting China directly. And Trump, for all his bluster, understands that confronting China militarily in the Persian Gulf while already engaged in a failing campaign against Iran is not something the American military is capable of managing successfully right now. And this moment, this one Chinese tanker passing through the Strait of Hormuz was watched very carefully in East Asia. The opposition leader in Taiwan traveled to Beijing and met with President Xi Jinping around the same period. That is not a coincidence. Taiwan is watching the United States pour military resources into West Asia, exhaust its capabilities in a war that after 40 days it has not been able to win, and ask themselves a very serious question. Is American security guarantee credible? If the United States cannot decisively defeat Iran, a country of 85 million people under decades of sanctions, how exactly is it going to protect Taiwan from China? The answer that more and more people across East Asia are arriving at is that the American security umbrella is not what it used to be. And that rethinking is going to accelerate. Look at what happened with Spain. Pedro Sanchez went to Beijing. He met with President Xi Jinping in person. He said that China and Spain are principled and reasonable countries. He said they should stand on the right side of history together. He called for opposing the law of the jungle and building a genuine multipolar order based on respect and pragmatism. Now, Spain is a NATO member. Spain is a European Union country. Spain is embedded in every Western institutional structure that exists. And its prime minister went to Beijing and essentially told Washington and Tel Aviv that Spain is going to chart its own course. That is extraordinary. That is not something you would have expected even 2 years ago. But Trump's aggression, the wars that Netanyahu is driving, the economic damage being inflicted on European countries, all of it is pushing European leaders to make calculations that a few years ago would have seemed politically impossible. And the Western media, I want to say something clearly about the Western media because people need to understand this. When it comes to empire, when it comes to supporting American military aggression and Israeli expansion, there is no difference between The Guardian and Breitbart. There is no difference between the BBC and Fox News. They use different language. Some are more subtle. Some are more bombastic. But they are all serving the same function. They all justified the war on Iran. They all look away from the genocide in Lebanon just as they looked away from Gaza. In Gaza, they had the excuse, a false excuse, of saying journalists were not allowed in. In Lebanon, there are journalists. Western journalists are on the ground. And still they describe the bombing of apartment buildings full of families as strikes on Hezbollah strongholds. I have spoken personally to some of these journalists. I have asked them directly why they write what they write when they know what is actually happening. And they tell me that they write honestly, but the editors change their reports before publication. And I tell them that this is not a moral defense. These reports appear under your name. You are whitewashing a genocide under your own byline, but this is how the system works. These journalists work for media organizations that are controlled by the same class that profits from these wars and that funds these politicians and that shapes this entire order. And the Washington Post, during the negotiations in Islamabad, published an opinion piece calling for the murder of the Iranian negotiating team. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A major American newspaper published a piece saying that the people sitting at a negotiating table trying to prevent war should be killed. We were all thinking about this on the flight back. We were expecting that there was a genuine possibility we would be killed on the way home. The plane did not fly back to Tehran directly. It landed near the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan and Turkmenistan in Mashhad, so that if the Americans or Israelis wanted to shoot it down near Tehran, they would not have the opportunity. Some people took trains. Some took cars. They got back to Tehran through various routes. This is the world we are living in. The media calls for murder and the government attempts to carry it out, and no one in Washington says a word about it. While those negotiations were happening, something else occurred that tells you everything about American intentions. American naval vessels tried to enter the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC Navy blocked them. There is footage of this. Iranian drones were flying overhead. The Americans were warned clearly, and they backed down. The IRGC Navy issued a formal statement saying that passage through the Strait of Hormuz is permitted only to non-military vessels following specific regulations. That reports of American military vessels passing through freely are false. That any attempt by military vessels to pass will be met with a firm and harsh response. And they meant it. The Americans backed down, but simultaneously the American media was running stories saying everything was fine, the ships passed through without incident. This is simply not true. There is footage. There are drone videos. The Americans attempted entry and were turned back. The Americans seem to believe that if they assert something confidently enough, it becomes reality. It does not work that way. There is a pattern here that I think people across the world are beginning to recognize. The United States has spent 40 years telling the world that Iran is this isolated, backward, unstable country on the verge of collapse. They have been saying this for 4 decades. And in those 4 decades, Iran has developed its own defense industry. It manufactures its own missiles, its own drones, its own radar systems. It has trained and equipped allied forces across the region. It has withstood every sanction, every embargo, every assassination campaign. And after 40 days of direct military confrontation with the United States and Israel and their coalition partners, with NATO intelligence assets flying over Turkey, gathering information, with bases across the region being used, with 5 Gulf dictatorships providing support, with Jordan cooperating, with the entire collective West effectively aligned against it, Iran was still firing missiles and drones and destroying American assets as late as 40 days into the conflict. That is not what a country on the verge of collapse looks like. And I want to say something about the countries that chose not to act when they could have. Erdogan in Turkey received a threat from Netanyahu. The Israeli prime minister essentially told him that Turkey could be next. And Erdogan issued a statement, words. But Turkey, throughout the entire 2.5 years of genocide in Gaza, continued to export oil through its territory from Azerbaijan to Israel, continued to allow NATO infrastructure on Turkish soil to be used to gather intelligence against Iran. Turkey was embedded in the system that enabled all of this. Qatar allows Al Jazeera to criticize Israel softly, but Qatar also hosts American military bases and has never taken any concrete action that would impose real costs on the Israeli regime. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the Emirates. These regimes are all American proxies, and everyone in the region knows it. And the people of these countries know it too. But public opinion and government policy are 2 completely different things in these systems. The people can protest. The governments will do what Washington tells them to do. Netanyahu threatened Turkey not because he fears Turkey. He threatened Turkey because he is signaling the next phase. Look at the maps that the Israeli regime and its supporters circulate. Look at the vision of Greater Israel that the American ambassador to the Israeli regime described openly in his interview with Tucker Carlson. He said that if the Israeli regime takes the entire region, that is fine. That is American policy. Not a fringe view. American policy. The same ambassador was not rebuked. He was not removed. He was not told he had spoken out of turn, because he had not spoken out of turn. He had simply said openly what the policy actually is. And that policy means that Syrian territory, Lebanese territory, Saudi territory, Jordanian territory, Egyptian territory, all of it is being looked at as eventual space for expansion. The Saudi princes and Jordanian kings may think that their relationships with Washington protect them. They do not understand that when the time comes, they will simply leave on their private jets with their billions deposited in Western banks, and the territories they claimed to govern will be absorbed. The only entities that are genuinely standing in the way are the Islamic Republic of Iran and the axis of resistance. That is why this war happened. Not because of a nuclear weapons program that does not exist, as Joe Kent admitted in his resignation letter. Not because Iran was threatening anyone, because Iran and the forces aligned with it represent the only serious obstacle to the completion of this project. And that is also why the negotiations in Islamabad were never going to succeed. Netanyahu called Vance during those talks. Netanyahu told Vance what to do. And Vance complied. In the middle of the night, Vance announced the negotiations had failed and tried to blame Iran for pursuing a nuclear weapon. That was a lie. Everyone knows it was a lie. But the purpose was not to make a credible argument. The purpose was to provide cover for walking away from talks that Israel had decided must not succeed. Now the world is watching all of this very carefully. The global majority has sided with Iran in this conflict. Countries that have heard nothing but anti-Iranian propaganda for 47 years, countries that know very little about Iran, countries far from the region, they have watched what has happened, and they understand who is the aggressor and who is the victim. Taiwan is rethinking its dependence on American security guarantees. Spain is reaching toward China for a new kind of international relationship. More European countries are going to follow. South Korea and Japan are watching their energy costs skyrocket and their economic stability threatened because of decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv that no one asked them about and that serve no interest of theirs whatsoever. The arrogance of this system is becoming impossible to ignore even for governments that have been deeply embedded in it for generations. Trump has done something that decades of patient diplomatic work could not have accomplished. He has made the costs of American hegemony so visible, so immediate, so painful, that countries which would have never questioned it openly are now questioning it openly. The energy crisis that is coming is not just about oil prices. It is about fertilizer. It is about LNG. It is about the petrochemical products that go into manufacturing across the entire global economy. It is about helium, which is critically important for the chip industry and for artificial intelligence infrastructure. All of these things flow through or near the Persian Gulf. All of them are now at risk. And the American economy is not going to be spared from this. American consumers are going to feel it at the pump and at the grocery store. American businesses are going to feel it in their supply chains and their operating costs. The billionaires in the American oil and gas industry will profit enormously. Everyone else in America will suffer. And when people are suffering economically, they want to understand why. And increasingly, the answer they are finding is that their vice president was reporting to a foreign prime minister, that their government launched a war not because it was necessary for American security, but because the Israeli lobby demanded it, that they are paying the price for a project of regional domination that has nothing to do with their lives and their interests and their futures. That information is spreading. It is spreading on social media. It is spreading through independent journalists and podcasters who are doing the work that the mainstream media refuses to do. And it is contributing to a shift in American public opinion that the political class in Washington is not yet prepared to confront, because that political class lives in a bubble. Republican and Democrat alike, they share a fundamental assumption that America sits at the center of the world and that American power is unlimited and that American exceptionalism gives them rights that no other nation possesses. Trump has that in an extreme and particularly foolish form. But his opponents among the elite have it too. They just express it with better vocabulary and more refined manners. The sense that America can do whatever it wants, that its judgments supersede international law, that its military can go anywhere and impose any outcome, that assumption is what has driven every catastrophic foreign policy decision of the past several decades. And it is what is driving this one. Except this time, the assumption is visibly, demonstrably, irreversibly colliding with reality. Iran is still standing. The axis of resistance is still functioning. Chinese ships are sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. Spain is in Beijing. Taiwan is rethinking. The global economy is heading toward a serious crisis. And the American empire, which was already in decline before any of this began, has accelerated that decline dramatically through this war. The unipolar moment, that period after the Soviet Union's collapse when the United States could genuinely claim to be the world's only superpower able to dictate terms to everyone else, that moment is over. It did not end quietly. It ended with missiles flying over the Persian Gulf and a Chinese tanker sailing past an American blockade and a vice president calling Netanyahu for instructions on how to conduct American foreign policy. What happens next is not fully determined. The war is not over. The situation remains dangerous. The Israelis are still slaughtering families in Lebanon every single day. Buildings are being bombed from morning to night. Western media covers almost none of it. There are journalists there who know exactly what is happening, and their editors change their reports before publication. The ethnic cleansing is proceeding. Apple Maps, as people have noticed and verified, has removed the names of towns in southern Lebanon. This is not an accident. This is preparation. This is creating the cartographic reality before the demographic reality catches up to it. The same logic that erased Palestinian villages from maps is being applied to Lebanese villages now. And the silence from Western governments and Western media is, if anything, even more complete than it was for Gaza. But here is what I want people to understand as we close this conversation. The forces that are driving this catastrophe are not invincible. They feel invincible right now because they have the weapons and the money and the control of the dominant media institutions. But they are making mistakes. Large, expensive, irreversible mistakes. They underestimated Iran. They underestimated the resilience of the axis of resistance. They underestimated how the world would react. They underestimated the economic consequences of their own decisions. They are now trapped in a situation where every option available to them is worse than the one before. Expanding the war risks confrontations they are not prepared for. Accepting a negotiated outcome that Iran can live with means admitting that all of this achieved nothing. Maintaining the current situation means watching the global economic damage mount and watching allied countries drift further and further from the American orbit. The Chinese tanker that sailed through the Strait of Hormuz is a small thing in one sense. It is one ship. But in another sense, it is a symbol of something very large. It is a symbol of a world that is no longer willing to organize itself around American permission. A world that is building new relationships, new trade routes, new political alignments, new ways of thinking about security and sovereignty. That world is not fully formed yet. But it is forming, and the arrogance and the recklessness of those who currently hold power in Washington and Tel Aviv are doing more to accelerate its formation than anything Iran or China or Spain could have done on their own. This is the irony of empire in its final stage. It creates, through its own violence and overreach, the very conditions that bring about its end.